Because social hour coming up. One of Jennifer's co-authors on many pieces is Renee, who's listed here as Intel Research, but for today she's still here. Which means she already has her PhD and she left us, and that's all right. But welcome back, and she'll tell you about her dissertation work as well.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Or is this not working? Can you hear me in the back?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, I've been working with the TIER group since 2003, and it has been a really interesting process of interacting with technologists and overcoming differences in language. But I think it's really been an exciting thing, and being part of a group that's contributing to the community on ICTD. So the title of my talk is actually the title of my dissertation, so I'm not going to talk to you about my entire dissertation, but I want to talk to you a little bit about a few pieces of it. So it's called Outsourcing Development, the State, Entrepreneurship, and ICTs. Just to give you a little bit of background on what my dissertation was about, I was looking at ICT kiosks in India, specifically in the South, and I took an ethnographic approach. So Jen has set up my talk very nicely about some of the issues that I'm thinking about from a different perspective within the social sciences. And I was looking particularly at public-private partnerships, trying to understand what are the roles of the different partners in these partnerships when they are with small-scale entrepreneurs. Often public-private partnerships are associated with large-scale industry partners. I was also looking at who benefits from these partnerships, how do perceptions and understandings of private versus public play out in a variety of ways for entrepreneurs as well as households. And then specific questions about the role of the state and the government itself in terms of how they're positioning themselves. Today, that's the general gist of what I was looking at in my dissertation, and this was one piece. I was trying to understand how citizens perceive, experience, and interact with the state. Do they interact with it differently in light of e-governance services that are provided in these kiosks? And so I took an ethnographic approach, doing a lot of interviews with state officials, entrepreneurs, and households, as well as used participant observation. I lived with entrepreneurs. I spent a lot of time in kiosks as well as in the houses of citizens, really trying to understand their perceptions and interactions with these kiosks. I looked at 2 states in India, Kerala and AP, Andhra Pradesh, and 4 kiosk projects within those states. So in talking about e-governance, I want to just situate the project of e-governance within the larger development paradigm of good governance, which Jen briefly touched upon. But international organizations, the World Bank, the IMF, and UNDP all talk about good governance as something that governments should embrace. And it's based on these principles of transparency, accountability, civil society participation. And this is operationalized in a number of ways. Restructuring and privatizing state bureaucracies, decentralizing government power from a national level to a local government level, reforming legal systems, and implementing public-private partnerships, which was at the crux of what I was looking at. In India specifically, this took form in a variety of ways. One was political reforms. Another was decentralization of power to the local government levels, and a proliferation of public-private partnerships in public service delivery in the last decade. And for my interviews with government officials, they talked about, reasons why they were embracing public-private partnerships was really because of limited budgets as well as financial and technical constraints. E-governance in India has also taken off, as Jen was talking about. And various goals that e-governance projects in India talk about are improving administrative processes and trying to emulate some of the private sector's qualities. So things like reliability, transparency, scalability, and the idea that you could actually treat a citizen like a customer. So really professionalizing the bureaucracy. ICT kiosks have been a mechanism by which to deliver these services to citizens. And these kiosk entrepreneurs that I was looking at were, these telecenters were all privately owned. And it was thought that these entrepreneurs had market-based incentives to perform efficiently. They're situated at a local level, so they know what the local needs are, and they're members of the communities that they serve. So this picture was in The Economist in 2008 in February. And I found it to be fascinating. It was part of a special report on technology and government. And this was part of an article on India as this flagship country that was really succeeding in e-governance. And what's interesting to me about this drawing is that it shows, this was supposed to be emblematic of the Indian state. That you have this fast, high-speed train with citizens sitting on top of it and inside of it, holding their computers and their laptops and their mobile phones, and it was supposed to represent the government as being transformed. And the Indian Railways, once associated with the slow-moving ways of the bureaucracy in India, has now been transformed through technologies and particularly with e-governance. And so that came to really what I found in my research, was that by partnering with entrepreneurs, the state found a way to really change the way it was being seen by citizens. The governments in both Kerala and AP were shifting the boundaries between the public and the private sectors through these ICT kiosks. And a lot of the images of the new images of the state were really influenced by the growing acceptability of technologies for service delivery, the reality of economic liberalization policies in India where the private sector is now seen as a legitimate partner for delivering government services, which may sound not that interesting, but it's a huge change in states like Kerala, which traditionally was very anti-private sector in many realms. And so I found that rather than actually removing the state and supplanting it with the private sector, the state actually found a space for itself to construct a better image of itself with respect to citizens. And so, similar to the interesting photos that Jen had about the Indian bureaucracy, you can see one of the photos that a government official showed me was that, this is how we want to look now. We no longer want citizens to see us in this light, but rather we want to be seen as efficient, as a private sector actor would act, and as very good in terms of our customer service to our citizens. And so my research found that there was a general consensus that the government officials needed to behave more like the private sector. And these kiosks really represented a new concept of the government that was able to leave behind an old legacy and was hassle-free, efficient, and accessible to, my favorite word, the common man, which is very laden and politically charged in India. And state employees, what I thought was fascinating was they were at least as concerned with their image, not just the experience that they've actually changed the way citizens receive services, but the image associated with that, as well as making those government services more streamlined. And so another way that this is from a presentation that a government official gave at an e-governance conference in India was that, now the government could be seen as not just walking up and standing in the sun and not getting a glass of water when you're experiencing or interacting with the state, but sitting down in an air-conditioned room with someone who treats you in a polite manner. And so this was a privately run kiosk which was branded as the government. So the government found a way to use the private sector to change its own image. And so in terms of entrepreneurs, the citizens that I spoke to said, talked about how they really understand the state through their everyday interactions with the people who represent it, be it a local bureaucrat or, in this case, a kiosk entrepreneur. And entrepreneurs now, even though they're not state employees, they have come to represent the state and also affect its legitimacy, depending on how they're interacting with citizens. They emphasized themselves that they had a better ability to serve citizens than the government, and that they actually, in the case of e-governance, were benefiting from the government brand because they found a legitimacy that citizens needed to actually go and pay their bills or interact with the government if they were going to do it in a private venue. Citizens as well talked about how they found that entrepreneurs treated them with a level of respect that they did not receive from these government bureaucrats they interacted with in the past, and that they often resented the way they had been talked about. So things like speed, convenience, and customer service were things that citizens now found with these kiosks. What I thought was interesting was that there was a simultaneous trust and disillusionment with the government. Ordinary citizens trusted in the credibility of the government name, but they were often dissatisfied with government services. But at the same time, they thought that the private sector was also a skeptical entity that didn't necessarily cater to the needs of its citizens or the poor. And so what I found was a real blurring of boundaries of the state and the private sector, and a very hybrid version of government, which the Indian government was putting forth as its strategy for constructing a new way for citizens to interact with it. And so it was really reworking the way citizens perceive the state as well as the state's perceptions of itself. So what does this mean? I always have this thing in the back of my mind that Eric Brewer is going to ask me, what does this mean? And I'm not going to be just a critical social scientist. Well, my title was called Outsourcing Development. Is this outsourcing the state? And I found that actually the state holds a very relevant role in the process of delivering services through ICTD kiosks. And I can talk about that more later. And that this type of research holds relevance to implementing kiosks and developing strategies for ICTD in India. So thank you to everyone, especially to the tier. Okay. Anyone?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
My experience of Indian bureaucracy, I don't like the word corruption very much, but I didn't get a feeling from your presentation of exactly what most of the traditional, in inverted commas, civil servants thought about the process. I mean, you did tend to suggest that they were positive, which isn't what I would automatically expect, because if their role is being taken out, if their opportunities for additional incomes, etc., their status, didn't you get any feedback about that being a negative experience? Yeah,
so I found that it depended on the level of government that which you're talking to. At the more policymaker level, they thought it was a good way in terms of changing their image. In terms of the actual state bureaucrat that was being replaced by the kiosk entrepreneur, I found instances in the Akshaya project in Kerala where they, initially when the whole project was being proposed, they were the biggest opponents because they felt that technologies and the private sector were going to take away their traditional roles.
ICTD kiosk, the internet kiosk stuff has worked in some instances and not a lot of instances. What has been your observation about the community's feedback to these ICTD kiosks in terms of actually getting them things that they want to get done? And secondly, the placements of these kiosks in, wherever they are in a village or a city center.
I found in terms of community feedback that it depended on what level, in terms of income level, you were talking to in the community. So oftentimes ICTD kiosks are implemented in the name of the poor, and in my research, particularly with education services and sometimes e-governance services, they were not the people that were using those kiosks. And they may use them for, in the case of Akshaya, there was a subsidized period where the poor were targeted to use these kiosks. And they were happy to use them during that period, but they didn't find relevant services that they themselves were willing to pay after that subsidized period was over. However, there were people just a few rungs up of the economic ladder who were willing to pay. So it was really thinking more specifically about who's actually being targeted in these projects and being strategic about understanding the local needs for that. And in terms of placement, in my research, and this has been different in other people's research in the northern part of India, but I found that in truly rural areas with populations of less than 5,000 people, that kiosks were not sustainable in terms of demand and willingness to pay for services.
Okay, thank you, Renee.